Wednesday, October 9th, 2002, and we are conducting an interview for the Veterans History Project at Brown Deer Middle School with Mrs. Krosky's 7th grade students and Mr. Art Oehler. Mr. Oehler, can you tell a little bit about yourself?
Well, I lived to be 79 so far, and when I went in the service I was 19, and things were a lot different then. People are used to traveling these days. We had never been anywhere, and when we went into service this was a very big change. We left home. We started out at Fort Sheridan, Illinois, got all our uniforms, clothing, shots, physicals. Every other day it seemed you got a physical. And we were there for several weeks, and they shipped us down to Mississippi. And this was going into November. It was cold. And the Army way was, if you moved any place, if you were going north, you went in your summer uniform. If you were going south, you wore your winter uniform, supposedly to confuse the enemy. So we went down to Mississippi in our winter uniforms in 90-degree weather on an old coal train with the windows open. And I would say by the time we got halfway there, we were all streaked with soot from the windows, from the coal coming in. It was a long ride. Mississippi was basic training, about 8 weeks. More physicals, more shots, more physicals again. And we finished that part of our basic training. We went down to Texas. About as far as you can go in Texas, close to the border of Mexico, was the King's Ranch. I don't know if you've ever read about it, but this was cowboy country yet. There were signs on the roads, trespassers will be shot. It was mean-looking country and mean-looking people. And that was where I had my first ride in an airplane. And we studied the gunnery there. Spent my first Christmas there. And it was warm. And he had big ditches on the side of the road. We couldn't figure out what these big ditches were for. And just before Christmas, it started raining. And after about 3 days, these 6-foot deep ditches were filled to the top of the water, overflowing. When you marched to your barracks, you went down the road and you looked where the door was, and you stood in the road and you walked through the water on the planks to get to the barracks. If you went off the planks, you were swimming. So we were kind of glad to get out of there right after Christmas. From there we went up to Denver, Colorado. And in the Army's way of thinking again, we were going north, so we had to leave in our summer uniforms. And we got up to Denver. They were in the midst of a week-long snowstorm. And all our clothes were shipped up to Utah by mistake. So we had about a month with summer uniforms. We had old barracks that were ready to be tore down. They gave us some blankets. We slept on the floor there. And after about 3 weeks, they finally got us into the gunnery school. And by that time, there were a lot of sick people. There was about 160 of us to start with. And every week there was guys were dropping down with pneumonia. They were going to the hospital. And this kind of broke the whole group up because they were in the hospital 3-4 weeks. By the time they get done, the classes were either ahead of them or in back of them, so they kind of got put on the side. I was lucky, I guess, I was in one of the last batches to get the pneumonia. And I was in the hospital. And the nurse that was in charge of the ward, we joked with her and talked, and she was asking if anybody had been home yet since we got into service. And we said no. So she arranged for the 6 of us that were in the last bunch. We got a 30-day leave to go home, recuperate, which was very nice. And I think if we wouldn't have got that leave, we wouldn't have seen home again for the rest of our service. We finished gunnery school there. We learned how to take guns apart, put a blindfold on, in a dark room. It was interesting, to say the least. And this was mountain country. They had an hour of calisthenics every day. And when you come from the lowlands of Texas to the mountains, you start exercising, and pretty soon everybody's nose starts bleeding. You turn around and look, and they're all doing jumping jacks with blood coming out of their nose. That lasted for about a week, but then you get used to it. And we went from Colorado to go overseas. We were shipped to Fort Dix in New Jersey. And right on the beach by the boardwalk, but there weren't very many people there because it was all blackout during the war. They had more physicals, more shots. And we would have the calisthenics there. We would either run along the boardwalk or along the beach. And when you first got there, you could run everybody into the ground. But after you were there 2 weeks, you were just like the rest of them again. Your tongue was hanging out after a while. So they kept bringing groups of people together in this hotel. I always remember the Army had a funny way when you were in a big building. You always thought you should go up one side of steps and come down on the other. Never what was closest for you or the most convenient. So they had a dining hall set up in the basement when it was time to eat. 6 floors of guys had to go in the same stairway and try and get down to the basement to eat. You would sit on the stairways and move and sit and move. And when you got done, you had to go up the empty stairway on the other side. I don't know why we couldn't use 2 stairways, but that was life. So one dark and rainy night, as usual, we got on a train and we went to New York, and we got on a troop ship, the Queen Elizabeth. The Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Mary were the 2 big boats that took troops over. They didn't go in convoys because they were too fast. The convoys couldn't keep up with them. So those boats sailed alone across the ocean. And like I said, we went on at night, and this boat was pretty well loaded by the time we got there. The upper decks, the open decks, they had wooden canvas cots, like 3 high, and those were all taken already. And finally we got to the middle of the boat, and they started going down. And, we went down to the decks just about by the water line. We found a place to sleep. But then we found out the next day that it got the same system again. You go to eat, you got to go up the back of the boat. When you're done eating, you go down the front of the boat. It's supposed to be very efficient. And we started looking around for a better place to sleep. There was 4 of us. And when you get on the boat below the water line, the bulkheads are all sealed, the doors. In case something happens, one bulkhead floods and the rest of them don't take on water. But while they were near shore yet, these bulkhead doors were open. So we wiggled through some of them and we found a place that was empty, nice sized room. Found out it used to be a swimming pool. It was all tiled, had little walls around it and everything, a tile floor, the swimming pool. So this looked like a pretty good place to sleep instead of above the decks and all over. So we made that our home for the 6 days that it took us to get across. They also had a system that everybody that was below every day should change and go up the back of the boat on top, and the guys that were on the back came on the bottom. So they could sleep inside at night, and you slept outside at night. But we figured as long as nobody was coming in there, this was our place to sleep 6 days while we were there. So that was comfortable. Then we got to England. Actually, we landed up in Scotland. Kind of an odd name. The Firth of Forth. F-I-R-T-H, I guess is what they call these bays there. And the name of the place was the Forth, F-O-R-T-H. So we landed at the Firth of the Forth on the 6th. So the idea was to get off the boat fast, because there was always problems with air war there. We got on the train, we went only a short ways, and then we were on the siding for a while because the freight trains had the right-of-way. And we finally got to a place, I couldn't tell you the name of it, but it was a replacement depot. All the guys that come over there went to this depot, and it was decided where you went according to your MOS, your occupation, what they call it. Well, our occupation was gunners, so we went to the airfields. We had radio men, they went to the airfields. Truck drivers went to different places. Of course, every airfield needed truck drivers, cooks, machinists, fellows that worked on the airplanes, the people that flew them. So there was more physicals and more shots again. And we wound up at Hardwick Air Base, the 93rd Bomb Group. And they had work for us right away because they were waiting for us. They needed replacements to replace people that didn't make it. Crews were shot down, the whole crews were missing. Some had crash landings, sometimes some survived, some didn't. So they put us to work right away. We had got in with a crew that had lost one fella as a replacement. And these were Nissen huts. I don't know if you ever saw pictures of them, but they were round iron huts with a concrete floor. You had two doors. You went in the first door, you closed that, then you opened the second door because of everything was black out there. There were no lights at night anywhere. Trucks had just little slits open on the headlights, the rest were taped shut. You could even get chewed out for lighting a cigarette sometimes if there was a mean officer around that wanted to show his rank. He would tell you that you were inviting trouble from the enemy by lighting a cigarette lighter. And you could hear planes at night coming. The German planes sounded different than the American planes, the motors. The American planes, the motors were synchronized. It was a steady sound. The German motors went rrr, rrr, rrr. You know it was a German plane coming over when you heard that noise at night. And then the searchlights would go up, and depending where these planes were going. But England was, especially the bigger cities, was being bombed very much at that time at night. And some of the seaport cities, any place that they could cause trouble to stop the British were being hit. But shortly, about that time, a little later, the British started getting more planes. More planes were coming over from the United States, and you had a better air defense system set up. And if you would go in the control tower at night, you could hear the radios. When German planes were coming, the radar units around here would give their location and their heading, and you could hear the British night fighters. They would call them and tell them there's 3 planes coming here, and these fighters would go up. It's hard to see them at night, especially if it was a dark night. They would give them map headings to fly at, and you could hear them talk back and forth, and all of a sudden they would say you should be within 5 miles from them. It would be quiet for a while, and then you would hear somebody say, "Tally-ho!" That was their side for going in. And you'd hear some noises, and it would be quiet. You either shot them down or they got shot down. So this went on pretty steady for a while. And finally, the Germans lost so many planes over there that they gave up on the night bombing. Once in a while, some would sneak over, but not too often anymore because they were losing too many planes and men. And while this was going on at night, you would go out during the day. Probably, depending where you were going to bomb that day, you would maybe get up, they'd wake you up maybe 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. You'd go for breakfast, a mess hall. You usually got dried eggs, powdered eggs. And powdered eggs, when they were made, don't look anything like real eggs. You get them in a big pan, and the longer they cook them, the darker green they get around the edges. And they don't taste very good unless you're very hungry. And bread, coffee, tea, milk, that was about it for breakfast. And you went to the briefing room, found out where you were going that day. And the gunners would go out then, and the pilots and the radio men would stay there, in the navigators in that briefing. They would get all their information, what they needed. And then we would go to the equipment place and get our parachute and put on our clothes. Well, the first thing when you got up in the morning, you put your winter underwear on right away, and your woolen shirt, woolen pants, and a jacket. And when you got there with the equipment, they had your flying clothes. It was a pair of coveralls, zippers, and you had a pair of leather pants. It was this yellow sheep wool inside, about that thick. They were very warm when you had them on the ground. You put those pants on, and you had a jacket the same way, a heavy leather, big sheepskin. And you had a Mae West. That was the life preserver because you were flying over water. That had to go on. And your parachute harness had to go on. And you had a chest pack parachute so that you could carry. And you had a couple pair of gloves, the helmet that went on, your goggles, your oxygen mask. They dumped all the loose stuff in a bag, and they had trucks going around. The airfield was set up in a big oval, and all the planes were dispersed, not in a line or anything like that. So these trucks came, and you'd stand out there, and they'd pick you up, and you'd holler to them number 8 or number 7 or number 6, whichever spot your plane was parked in. And they would let guys off all the way around. It was still dark out yet. You would get to the plane, And later the pilot and the rest of them would come. You would go in and start checking your equipment. I flew in a tail turret. I'd go up there, crawl in the back. The guns were ready because you cleaned them during the day when you weren't flying and everything. Unless it was a morning that the rain was freezing or something like that, then you would have to crawl up in there, take the guns apart, snake them out of there, wipe them off, dry them, put a little bit of oil on them, put them back in, because if they froze up, you were in trouble. And most people don't realize, but we usually went about 20,000 feet, 21,000 feet flying. And it could be anywhere from 20 degrees to 50 degrees below zero up there. And it was very cold. And these planes, this particular plane that we flew in, the B-24, on the side back here were two big windows. I'd say were about that long and maybe a little wider than this. So the wind is blowing in there while you're flying. And you're flying at about 200 miles an hour. So it was very drafty in there and cold. Oh, and I forgot, after a while you had a heated suit too. That went over your woolen clothes, and you put the heated suit on, then you put the rest on top, and you had a extension cord hanging out. When you got in a plane, you could plug it in the electrical system, you could get heat. It was nice to a point, but too many of those suits used to catch on fire, especially when you had your arms bent all the time when you were sitting. These wires in here would fray and crack, and pretty soon smoke would start coming. So you better pull the plug out fast before you start a fire. So it was nice to use them, but you didn't use them no more than you had to, really. Turn them on and off every once in a while when you started shivering or something. While you would go up in the air, each plane take off separately. They were loaded to the hilt with gas, and the bomb load usually was 12 500-pounders, and the gas was about 2,500 gallons of gas in the wings. That was pretty much the limit of what they could do. You would get on the end of the runway, and we were in the back of the plane, two race gunners, myself, and a ball gunner. There was like a bulkhead there. It was the front of the plane, the bomb bay, and the back of the plane. We would sit with our back against the bomb bay on the floor. One guy would sit, and the other would sit in front of him up against his knees with the knees pulled up, just in case something happened, taking off. He would take off, and most of the time there was a haze in the morning or it was cloudy, and you had to form a group in order to go. So you would take off, and you would have a certain heading to fly up through these clouds. And after a certain number of feet, you would start making circles, even if you were in the clouds yet. And occasionally, you could get a quick glimpse of another plane through the opening in the clouds a little bit. So it was always kind of nervous going up there because crashes happened. People would do the wrong thing, get in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that's it. Two of them would go together, and that was it. We had one plane, an old beater that was painted with big stripes and everything. You could really see it. That was the plane you were supposed to form on. And it took sometimes an hour and a half for the planes to get from the ground up to 10, 12, 15,000 feet. It depended how high the clouds were, that they could make a formation. And then this squadron would go, and this one over here was forming, and all these different groups would come together. And by the time you started going across the English Channel, supposedly everybody was where they should be. And every once in a while, a plane would have some mechanical trouble. They would drop out, radio that they were leaving. Once you got across the coast, it wasn't too good to drop out, because then you were a plane flying alone. And that's what the fighters like, to find one plane by themselves. Then they would gang up on them. So after you hit the French coast, you usually got a greeting. Any aircraft fire would start, depending what cities you were going over. And then it would end a while, and they tried to map out some of these places that you could kind of go around some of the bigger cities, but it always wasn't practical to do that because of the distance that you went, the gas you were using. And then you would get closer to the target, and if this was the target, they never flew right to it. They flew to one side or the other side to make sure for any variations in the flying, in case somebody was off a quarter of a mile or something like that. And when you got to that point, then everybody made a turn, and that was called the bomb run. From then on, the pilot flew the plane, but he couldn't make any changes. The bombardier had the bomb sight, and that was hooked into the controls. So the bombardier would give him a heading to go, and a speed, and that's what the pilot had to hold. And the aircraft fire would start coming up, and he would call it one way or the other, you know. And they could see it coming up right ahead of the plane, the black puffs, but actually there was no place to go. You had to go straight ahead, but you had the idea that maybe if they went this way, there would be a little less. So you see these black explosions. The closer they were, you could see red in the inside when the shell burst. And black smoke would come up. And if they were close enough, you could sometimes hear a rattling on the plane where the little pieces would hit and come in. And thankfully, we never had any of the big pieces come. But some of the planes were damaged pretty bad once in a while. People were hurt. And the shells that they used, some of them had a fuse that it had to hit something before it exploded. And other shells were like pressure. They set them for a certain number of feet. If they figured you were flying at 20,000 feet, they could figure out pretty well where you were at. They used those fuses for 20,000 feet. So you'd see some below you, some even with you, some above you, some on the sides of you. And the first couple of times, it really worried me. But after a while, you get sort of, it ain't going to be me idea. It's going to be somebody else. I hope. You put that I hope on the end. And that's the way you did it. So went over on the bomb run. When the time was dropping, they dropped them. They found out that if everybody dropped on a signal, they got better results than if everybody dropped them separately. So when they got the signal, they would drop them. And the idea was to drop the nose down to gain some speed and make a turn and get out of there as fast as you could. And you were on the way home. Usually when the anti-aircraft fire was up, the fighter planes didn't come in because they found out that once in a while when the fighter planes came in, they were blowing up their own planes. So you could see them on the outside, and once you got out of the main target, then they would come to pay you a visit, cause as much trouble as they could, especially if they could find some stragglers that were slower. Maybe they had a engine knocked out or two engines, they couldn't keep up. Those are the ones they went for. And when we started, American fighter planes could only go in so far, and they had to turn around and leave us. And the Germans knew how far they could go and when they would leave, and that's when they would come. But then after a while, the fighter planes, they found out that they could put extra tanks on them under the wings with extra fuel. And they could fly, they could use those tanks until they were empty, and then they could blow them off, they would drop, and then they would use their regular tanks, and that increased the distance that they could stay with us, like into Berlin, Schweinfurt, those places. They could stay with the bombers that long, and that made a big difference. The fighter planes, we call them our little friends, they would be above you always, and they had a zigzag, they were faster, and some would stay high, and some would stay low, and they would keep a watch for the fighter planes. And it made the job a lot easier then, because the fighter planes were being shot down by our planes, so there weren't so many of them actually attacking the bombers anymore. And then the problem was to get home. As long as everything was working all right, it was fine. If you had problems, sometimes a hydraulic line got shot out, or an electrical thing got hit, you had to make up for it. Sometimes after they made it all the way back across the channel and they were getting ready to lower down to load a landing gear, they find out they pressed a button and the light doesn't go on. Piece of anti-aircraft fire went through either the hydraulic unit or something like that. So being very thorough, they had a way that you could crank them down by hand. But that was work for like 3 people.
Okay, now it's running again.
All right. When these planes get back to the base, the ones that have damage or wounded aboard or have problems, they fire a red flare, maybe 2 or 3 of it. And they let anybody else that's in a pattern has to keep going around. So these planes that are shooting the red flares can land because they got problems. The planes land, hopefully none of them run off the runway or anything or bang up that everybody can get down. If there's a problem, they try and get the plane off to the side as quick as they can. They hook tractors to them and pull them on the side, bulldozers for pushing anything to get them out of the way so everybody can get down. And there's always guys at the end of the runway counting the planes when they come to see if there's the 15 that left or 14 or how many are coming back, just in case. So finally you're on the ground. I'll leave it go at that. How's that?
Okay. All right. Who's got a question now? Let's see. Question in a certain order? Okay.
Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I enlisted. I was 19 when I enlisted.
Where were you living at the time?
In Milwaukee. Lived there all my life.
Was there a particular reason why you decided to enlist instead of maybe waiting to be drafted?
Well, my brother was 4 years older than I was, and he was working on an apprenticeship as a carpenter, and he had a year to go yet. So I thought that maybe he'd be home for another year, he could finish his apprenticeship, and I my father wasn't feeling too good, and they could use the money while he was working. So I enlisted in the Air Force. I figured that sounded pretty good to me. So that's what I did. And neither my father or my mother wanted to sign the papers to start with, but one pushed it to the other, and the other back and forth a couple times, and finally my dad signed the papers to go.
So you were only 17 when you enlisted?
19.
19. And your
Yeah.
parents still had to sign
Yeah.
to give permission? Oh.
Yeah. And like I say, they didn't care to, but I had my mind made up. I was going to do it.
Why did you join the service?
Well, I figured my brother would be home for a while and he could finish his apprenticeship. And
How did you feel patriotically? You know, what was your sense
everybody
of
was
duty to
pretty-
country and that
yeah,
kind of thing that made you?
everybody was pretty mad about it, the way all of this stuff happened. You know, with Pearl Harbor just before that, it was still in people's minds. I heard about Pearl Harbor. My uncle and I were out rabbit hunting. And we were coming home. We were on 76th and North Avenue, and he turned the car radio on. And we heard about Pearl Harbor. And he was a World War I veteran. And oh, he was upset. He was swearing a big bad. And everybody was upset about this, and figured you were going to get drafted. You knew that. So might as well try and get what you wanted. I thought being an aerial gunner would be good. So it worked out for me, but not for everybody.
Wait.
Oh, you have a follow-up question? Okay.
What branch of service did you join?
Air Force. It was the Army Air Force then, not the Air Force.
Okay,
There was no
and,
Air Force. It was the Army Air Force.
okay, and why did you join that branch?
Thought I would like it. It looked promising to me. Adventurous. And that picture of the guy with the cap and the silk scarf blowing out behind him.
Was there a certain division you were assigned to, or a squadron name that you belonged to?
Yep. This is what I belong to. Ted's Flying Circus. It's traveling circus because we went back and forth to Africa a couple times.
Now, why did they call it Ted's Traveling Circus? Who was
It was,
Ted?
Colonel Ted Timberlake, the commanding officer. And I was the 93rd Bomb Group. It's right on the picture here.
Okay.
And there were 4 squadrons. The 328th, 329th, the 330th, and the 409th. And I was in the 329th. And I think I can even show you the picture, this picture here, the patches. Oh, here's the patches from the squadrons. I don't know if you can get them or not.
Let's see if I can.
Each one's got a number.
And which was yours again?
329th.
Okay, that'll be right up there in the corner. What? There's a cartoon character on that
There's
picture.
a
What?
lot of
Can you explain that cartoon character a little bit?
They're all cartoon characters. It was kind of like Howdy Doody would have been or something, you know. All the planes had names until at the end, then they had so many planes that we couldn't keep up with them. But our name of our plane was TARFU.
TARFU?
TARFU.
Spell it for us.
TARFU. The Army version would be things are really fouled up.
Ah,
If it could break, it will break. If it will get fouled up, it will fouled up. So that was the TARFU II. TARFU I actually was lost, and TARFU II. We got a second one named TARFU II. So, but they were named after pilots' wives, girlfriends, mothers, fathers, some of the nose art was beautiful work that was done. Some of it was kind of bawdy.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting always. You're flying up here and here's Mae West next to you, when you look. And there's always something to check on the artwork of everybody when you went with it. We wound up to be leaders of different squadrons. So we would always see their nose art compared to ours. So, anything else?
Okay, next question.
What war did you serve in?
What war? World War II.
And what were the years of your service in the war?
1942 to 1945.
Do you have a follow-up question?
What exactly was your job assignment?
Pardon me?
What was your job assignment?
Job assignment.
Job
so
assignment.
beside being, what?
A tail gunner.
Tail gunner.
I was that on a B-24 bomber.
Okay, next question.
Were there many casualties in your unit?
Were there many casualties? Where?
In your unit?
In your unit? Oh yeah, they had a good record. I'll say that. They didn't have as many as other ones, but it's bound to happen when you keep doing it day after day, week after week, month after month. Every time a plane goes down, there's 10 people in it, and sometimes you would see them, they would get hit and just blow up in the air, and you would see their pieces falling down, burning and everything else, and you would never see a parachute come out. Other times, they'd maybe get a tip of a wing blown off or the engine shot out, and they would start going down slower, like gradually, and you would see chutes coming out. You would try counting whether 10 got out or not. You couldn't tell who they were, but you could count 10 chutes. You knew everybody got out, went out before they blew up or hit the ground, So a lot of people were wounded. It was hard because you were in 40 degrees below zero weather. How do you take care of somebody when they're hit, It's, you gotta start ripping clothes off and gloves and whatnot all. And we had a first aid kit that had morphine in it. And if the guy was really hurting, why, you got the morphine kit and put the needle on it and give him a shot of morphine, so it would calm him down. You couldn't do much to stop bleeding. You open it up to the air, the stuff would freeze by itself. You could, after a while, throw some jacket on him or something to try warming him up again.
Were you awarded any medals or citations?
Yeah, and I don't know which ones.
How did you get them?
Pardon?
How did you get them?
Tell us a little bit about the medals you got and
Well,
how you.
the citations always say action above the call for duty, for regular duty. Some got fancy words, superior, something like that, extraordinary. Got the Distinguished Flying Cross. I got the Air Medal with 3 clusters. That means you got it 3 times.
Okay.
And you got the ETO ribbon. That showed it was the European Theater of Operations with 1 silver and 3 bronze battle stars. The silver battle stars were at 6 bronze stars, so there were 9 battle stars. And a ribbon for D-Day. We took part in D-Day. Just before the landings, we went over, well, you could see the big Navy boats offshore, I mean big ones, shelling inland. You could see the black smoke coming up where they were going for railroad yards and gasoline dumps and stuff like that to hit. And we bombed railroad yards that morning, about 6 o'clock.
I bet that they, probably being 7th graders, they don't know what D-Day is. Could you, do you? Do you know what D-Day is?
June 6, 1945, 1944.
44, I think.
44, yeah. Yeah, that was a big day. And shortly after that, we finished our tour of operations and we were sent home with 30 missions.
So it was, that was always the tour of duty? Once a man completed 30 missions, then he had completed his service?
Yeah.
And he was sent home.
Then they send you back to the States.
How'd you feel when you had completed that 30 missions and you knew you were going home?
Well, I didn't know when I was going home, but I felt good when I completed the 30th.
Uh-huh.
And the ground crew knew it was it. And they had what they called fire tanks. They were concrete ditches. They were long, sloping sides. They had water in them. In case of fire, the fire trucks would put their hose in it for the pumpers. So the custom was you finish your missions, you get thrown in the tank. So when you come up to come back and get your flying clothes off, turn them in and that, a couple of them were waiting and they grab you and throw you in the tank. And it was hard to get out because the sides are all green and slimy. Somebody, a couple of guys had to reach over to grab hold of you to help pull you out. But it was well worth it.
Gosh. Okay, who's got another question back there? I'm just going to pause this for.
Got hit. Either chewed up. This is the Flying Fortress that was hit there. These were taken out of the Stars and Stripes that used to get printed once in a while. Here's one of our planes, fondly known as Sterile Arrow. It was crash landed on the way in. There's a Flying Fortress that got hit in the tail. There's a fighter that got most of the nose blown off. It's surprising that these things held together, that they flew back and landed. This is a picture of our decoration at our base. Those wings were 120 foot long and they were loaded with guys. That was when they come back from Africa. Here's a plane that was sent back to Milwaukee, Boomerang. We went on a bond tour here. It's a plane from the 93rd. We all scratched our names and wrote our names on it. And my name was just under the window by that G back there. And I wrote home to my parents. And my sister took them to look at it, but they couldn't find my name on it. It was so scratched up with names. So this was the Stars and Stripes. That was the newspaper that was put out. And you found out how the rest of the war was going. The Russian front, the Italian, there's the Monte Cassino that caused all the problems. So these are old pieces of paper. There's a list of the missions. copy of it, that just a kind of a aerials. And this is a copy of a painting that was made of a 93rd plane coming in. And it had a hole in its wing and a hole in the back here, the tail rudder, and they'd been shooting off red flares, so the ambulance was trying to catch up to them when they stopped, in case they got to haul anybody out.
Now you've got some other pictures there in your envelope.
Yeah, these are some that I didn't even remember I had. These were the part members of the crew. This was me. This was our pilot,
Now the picture of you, about how old were you on that picture?
20,
And where was that taken?
in England at the air base. This was our captain, an ex-Bible salesman. He was the old man of the crew. He was about 28. He had 2 children.
What was his name?
Captain Doherty, Daughgerty. And this was the co-pilot. He was Frank Father.
Let's see if I can get him in the...
And this was
Hold on a sec.
that was the whole crew.
All right, now here we've got the pilot, and he's got a dog in his hands, but you didn't take the... weren't allowed to take the dog on
No,
the
the dog would have died up there
Uh-huh.
without oxygen. This was the flight engineer.
Let me get a
Some of
close-up
these are
first of the...
little copies.
Uh-huh.
That's the whole crew.
So you have 10 men in the crew
Yep.
and 5 gunners, did you say? How many gunners, and what were all the jobs for the people that were on the plane?
Pilot and a co-pilot,
Yeah.
a navigator and a bombardier. That was 4. Those were the officers. We had a flight engineer. He was also the gunner. We had a nose gunner, tail gunner, and 2 waist gunners.
Okay.
This was doing a radio operator. Almost forgot about Junior.
Who's that?
That's me. They made us put on old jackets and have picture taken in case we got shot down. If the resistance picked you up, they could use that picture for a ID card. Because a lot of guys that were shot down, the resistance picked them up and got them out. Passed them from one place to another till they got down to Sweden.
Explain a little bit who the resistance was.
That was the people that were fighting against the Germans, not in uniform. You couldn't be there in uniform, but the Germans were in all the cities, and well, they had the whole country, France, Holland, Belgium, all those countries. And these people were out to do everything they could to harm the Germans, to work against the Germans. Not to harm them really, but to work against them wherever they could. They worked in factories. People worked in ammunition factories. They goof up the shells so they wouldn't go off. If they were caught, it was shot on the spot. But they still did it.
So if you were shot down, you could almost count on the fact that there would be a member of the resistance out there to help you?
Not necessarily. They didn't. They were more. They were in small towns, big towns, but they had to watch out for themselves too, though, because if somebody would turn them in, we had people. French people were against French people. If they thought somebody was doing something, they reported them to the Germans. And
So you have to really watch your step then.
oh yeah, very much so, yeah. And he got hit in a very sensitive place, in his butt. All of a sudden he jumped and he said, "Oh my God!" I was swearing there. He hit me. He called it the right name. So he got ribbed for quite a while about that. So from then on, he took an extra jacket along. And he stood on a jacket besides wearing one. And this was when I come home on leave from overseas.
Those are
You
your
can see on
parents.
the jacket, the patch, the flying thing.
Those are your parents then?
That's my mother. This was a friend. He was come out of a tuberculosis sanitarium. He was 4F. We used to go visit him when we went to high school. When he was in there, he'd sit in these rooms with the windows open in the winter. That was the idea them days, the clean air, you know, that was supposed to clear you. Used to feel sorry for him.
What's the next picture? That looks interesting. That looks like a good close-up of a plane.
This one, yeah, that's one for bad weather. They had canvas covers over their gun turrets so they wouldn't get all soaked up, get the dampness in there. These are
Ooh, that's a
pretty
beautiful
good
shot.
pictures of a B-24 there. The window is closed on there. That's not a combat ship. The regular ones were all camouflaged until late in the fighting, then they didn't even bother to camouflage them anymore.
Now tell me a little more about this one.
Those are B-24s flying, trying to get into formation. When these troops came over from the States, some of these guys trained as crews here and came over. And we came over as replacements, but they didn't teach close flying here. So when they came over, the worst thing you could do was to get scattered across the sky, because we were separated them. So they had to teach them to fly, to put that wing right next to the other guy's wing. And they'd come over and over, and then they'd back off, you know, and you'd have to get on the radio phone and tell them, you put that wing in there and keep it there. And that was their problem. They were shaky on that. There was one group, the 44th bomb group. They called them everybody called them the 8 balls. Because every time they went out, they just got shot up something fierce. Your only safety was staying together. You had 3 up, 3 down, 3 here, 3 here, 3 here. And that's the way you protected each other. You know, there were 10 guns in that airplane, and where you could fire and where the other plane could fire, you were practically like in a cone. If the fighter plane came too close, he could attack, but he'd have to break away sooner before he was in range, or he could get chewed up something fierce. The only advantage he had was he had 20-millimeter cannon in the nose, so he could sit out farther and shoot. But as long as you sprayed some toward him and let him know that you see him, you know, most of the time, especially the first ones were braver. After a while, they were wearing them down through attrition. These guys didn't have the experience anymore, because Germany was at war 3-4 years before we were. They had crackerjack pilots to start with. After a while, they ran out
It
of
just wore down.
normal. Historical Society, these guys were all in the 8th Air Force in England in B-17s and B-24s. And some of them are spit and polish yet. They got their old jackets yet, and they wear uniforms. And here I am at the meeting. This guy here is a P-51 pilot. This guy here is a colonel in the Guard. He comes to the meetings. They're all well on in years. You know. I would say most of them are around 80, at least 80, some of them into the high 80s already. They were older when they went in.
Sure.
And they say there's about 1,500 a day dying throughout the United States, so we're going fast.
Okay, go ahead.
Did you feel pressure or stress?
Yeah, there was pressure and stress. You're always wondering what was going to happen next, what you were going to do next. You never knew where you were headed for when you got up in the morning. If you were going to stay at the base all day, or if you were going to take a joyride, let's say.
Okay. Was there something special you did for good luck? Good luck.
I can't hear the last part.
Okay. Was there something special you did for good luck?
For good luck. Ah, well, we always got out of the same side of the bed in the morning. We had our cots, and some guys always got out one side. I always got out on the left side. And my shoes were always by the bottom of the bed, the foot. I don't know if it helped or not, but
It must have.
How did you stay in touch with your family?
how did I stay in touch with my family?
Yeah.
Oh, well, there was what they call email. You wrote a letter, and it was put through a sort of a copy machine, and a letter on a regular sheet like that would be condensed onto a thing about this size, real small. And it went in an envelope and it was mailed. And otherwise, this was a compact way of sending it. And if they wanted to censor mail, they could always censor it at that time. And that's the way your family got the letter.
Oh, so just on a small piece of paper, they never were able to blow it up to
No,
a bigger size at the other end.
No. That, I don't know if you wrote a two-page letter, what you did. I think I never wrote a two-page letter.
Do you know if any of your mail was ever censored that you wrote home?
I really don't know. Nobody ever said so, or I never asked.
Mm-hmm.
The weather's lousy, the food is lousy. I feel good, you know.
Did they give you directions and tell you that when you wrote letters home there were things that you shouldn't say?
Well, yeah, they didn't want you to name where you were, your group outfit and that, but your address is on the envelope, so,
Mm-hmm.
you know. You had APO number, Army Post Office, and it was a number that you had, and ETO, European Theater, and that was it.
Mm-hmm.
That's how your mail got to you, and you put their address on the envelope.
Okay.
So,
Okay, next question.
What was the food like?
how was the food?
Yeah.
Well, I tell you, if you like Spam, if you really liked Spam, you were in heaven there. Because you had Spam for breakfast, Spam for lunch, and Spam for dinner for about 8 months straight. And after that, we went to corned beef. And if you like corned beef, then the rest of the time you were in heaven because you had that 3 times a day. That was about it for meat. Once in a while you would get maybe a piece of pork, but basically it was Spam and corned beef. And it could be good. I suppose you're going to, depending on the way you fix it, but the Army cooks weren't exactly caterers, you know. That was a job. You had to cook all day. They were grousing at the end of the day because tomorrow they were going to have to cook again. And one morning, the dried eggs were, everybody had been complaining about them for so long. And Colonel Boylan got in the line, unannounced. There was about 4 of them in back of me, and I heard them very clearly. He slapped that glop of eggs on a tray, and he said, he'd like eggs. And that guy popped the glop it on there, and he says, you call that eggs? And without looking up, the guy says, eat them and shut up, just like that, you know, he's half asleep. And then the first started flying. Ooh, he made it personally. He put some more eggs on that plate, he made the guy go over there and eat them eggs, every bit of it. And then he put the whole mess all on notice that they better start taking a little care with the food that they're cooking, that those dried eggs weren't fit for people to eat, you know, and stuff like that. So for a while it turned out better. But one of the best meals we had, we used to shoot rabbits. Rabbits were tremendous. There was nothing to go down the road and see 50, 100 rabbits in a field. Regular cottontails that we got here. And we started shooting the cottontails and trading them to the farmers for eggs. Well, to begin with, the farmers didn't want them. You know, you eat them? You eat them, Yank? Sure, good. Oh, yes. So they started giving us eggs for rabbits. And we had a frying pan, and there's a small stove in the hut. You put some wood in there and start it up, and cut a rabbit out, skin them, clean them, put them in a frying pan with some water and a cover and simmer it. An hour or so later, an hour and a half later, you had fried rabbit, like a delicacy. We had eggs we would fry once in a while. So it was a little, food was always a big question to get different food, but you could scrounge someplace. Big farm or steel, if need be.
Okay. Let's move on to the next question, okay? Because I'm afraid we're running out of time.
How did you entertain yourself?
Entertain ourselves. There wasn't very much to do for entertainment. Some guys gambled. Once in a while there would be a dance. Once in a while there would be a movie shown. But outside of that, make sure your ship was cleaned up okay and the guns were working. That was it.
Okay, how about yours?
Did you keep a personal diary?
No, I didn't. No, I was sorry that I didn't write stuff down, but my flight engineer kept sort of a diary, and I saw a couple pages of it. It was pretty good, too.
Did you make any close friendships while you were in the service?
Well, these are all my close friends because I depended on them, and they depended on me. I saw one of them after I come back from overseas. I saw him at Lowry Field in Colorado, and that's the last I saw any of them. Most of them are from the East Coast, and one is from North Carolina. The rest are Massachusetts and New Jersey.
What do you recall any particular humorous or unusual events?
Any humorous or unusual events?
Oh. Well, one time some fellows were in town with a truck, and they went past the railroad station, and in England the beer came in big barrels, and they knocked a spigot into it, and that's how they drew the beer in the pubs. They didn't have refrigeration like we had here. Everything is warm. You had warm beer all the time. And when you get down to the end of the barrel, you're spitting out hop seeds like that. It wasn't filtered or anything. So this was a truck with a canvas back, so they decided, they went around the railroad depot, nobody was around, so they lifted up the canvas, they rolled the barrel of beer on the back of the truck, dropped the canvas and rode out. So when they got back to base, now we got a barrel of beer, what are we going to do with it? So everything was in the woods. The huts were in the woods, all spread out, everything. The only thing out in the open was the actual airfield itself. So they set that barrel of beer in the woods. The carpenter shop just happened to come up with 2 cross pieces to set it on by accident, you know. So in the evening, if you wanted a a beer, you walked through the woods to the keg of beer and you had a cup of beer, which we thought was pretty good at that time. So one of the officers found out about it, and then all the officers came over there and they practically drained the keg that night, and they got sloshed, to say the least, and they made a lot of noise and a big disturbance, and they were the ones that got accused of stealing that barrel of beer, not us. We thought that was poetic justice that they suffered for a change instead of us.
Good story. Okay.
Do you recall the day your service ended?
Yes, that was at Fort Sheridan, Illinois. I was discharged. We were sent up there from Colorado as medics, typical Army. They expected 75 medics, and they got 75 gunners, radio operators, and truck drivers. And they couldn't figure out how a mistake like that happened. So I wound up the last 2 months of my service taking blood pressure in the line of the guys that were getting discharged. They were starting to discharge soldiers that had only been in a couple of weeks, but actually had to go through a physical again.
Mm-hmm.
So I was taking blood pressures on guys that were in the Army 5 days, 6 days, 7 days, and they were going for a discharge. We were here 3 years and we weren't getting one yet.
That's not justice.
That's not justice.
Where were you?
In Fort Sheridan, Illinois. That was the peak where I went in and where I came out.
And last question.
Did you join a veterans organization?
Yep, I joined the VFW out in Colorado when I came back from overseas, 1944. I was a member at large. You had to go someplace. They couldn't put you in a certain place because you were moving.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a member at large. And now I'm a member here in Milwaukee with Jerry Litzow. Like the character.
How about your last question?
Okay.
Okay. Did your military experience influence your thinking about war or about the military in general?
Well, you can see both sides of war. I think it's something that's got to be done at times when it gets too bad. Whether you like it or not, you got to do something about it. It didn't really influence me one way or another in my civilian life. You kind of shoved it in the back of your mind for about 10, 15 years, and then gradually you started thinking about things again, things that happened, or things that you saw, things that you heard, and then you figure that you didn't do much, actually, to start with, and then after a while you figure, maybe you did something after all, when you figure how many people were in the service, and how many of them actually got shot at, or shot back. I think at one time I read there was about 25 or 30 people to one person that actually was in combat, when you figure the cooks, the bakers, the postmen, and the mechanics and truck drivers and what all not, You had to have support, I'll say that, so somebody had to do this stuff to keep you going all the time. So maybe it was worthwhile, I think.
Okay.
It was 3 years of your life gone. You can't make that up anymore. But life was a lot different then, a lot slower. You can't imagine now how dumb we were. Didn't know nothing. Never went any place.
But you got to see a good part of the world when you were in the service.
Oh, you see England, Scotland. We went up to Glasgow once and we had leave. It was ancient country.
Mm-hmm.
It was a shame to see a lot of it destroyed. But A lot of it's been rebuilt again. But they were pretty backward there too at that time. Very backward. People there would talk to somebody on the road who were asking where this is or that is, and it's maybe 10 miles down the road. And he would say, sorry, Hank, never been there. Never been that far down that road. It's standing up. Never been down that far that road. You couldn't believe it. You know, that everything was so close there. It wasn't like here where there's miles between things. 10 miles, never been down the road. And the guy's maybe 50 years old. You know. Always went this way, but never that way.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for your stories. Our tape is about up, so we better stop here.
Okay,
Let-
well, I enjoyed it.
Sign off, and thank
Kinda
you.
rambling once in a while, maybe.
Great, wonderful story.
Today, I need this